Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. Returning an economic impact payment. COVID Tax Tip 2020-73, June 18, 2020. Millions of eligible individuals have already received their economic impact payments. There's a link to the economic impact payments here. There'll be a link to this in the description. Back to the text. Some people, including those who received a payment for a deceased individual, may be unsure whether they should return a payment. Here is additional information about returning an economic impact payment. How should an individual return an economic impact payment? Mail the payment to the IRS address based on state the person lives in, as indicated in the frequently asked questions about repayments. There's a link to those frequently asked questions about repayments here. There'll be a link to this in the description. Back to the text. When returning a paper check that was not cashed or deposited, taxpayers should write void in the endorsement section on the back of the check. Mail the voided Treasury check immediately to the appropriate IRS location. There's a link to the appropriate locations here. Don't staple, bend, or paperclip the check. Include a brief explanation of why they return the check. When returning a direct deposit or a paper check that was cashed or deposited, taxpayers should mail a personal check, money order, etc. to the appropriate IRS location. Once again, there's a link to those locations here. Make the check or money order payable to U.S. Treasury and write 2020 EIP, standing for Economic Impact Payment, and the taxpayer's identification number, social security number, or individual taxpayer identification number of the person whose name is on the check. Include a brief explanation of why they are returning the economic impact payment. Taxpayers should visit Economic Impact Payment Information Center, there's a link to that here, on irs.gov for information on how to return or request a replacement EIP, Economic Impact Payment, debt card. When returning a payment for someone who has died, a payment made to someone who died before they received the payment should be returned to the IRS. Return the entire payment unless it was made to joint filers and one spouse is still living. In that case, return half the payment, but not more than $1,200. If someone can't deposit a check because it was issued to both spouses and one spouse has died, the individual should return the check. Once the IRS receives and processes the return payment, an economic impact payment will be reissued to the surviving spouse. Just a quick overview on this in general. Just note that if you got an economic impact payment that doesn't apply, the IRS got it wrong. They shouldn't have given you the economic impact payment for whatever reasons, for one of these reasons, but a legitimate reason for not having it. Then you want to give it back typically, because one of the consequences then, if you don't give it back, will typically be that these payments were tied to the 2020 taxes, so they're basically kind of a credit for 2020. So the IRS is basically expecting that when we file the 2020 tax returns, that any kind of problems will basically work themselves out. And most of the problems, they've set it up so that if there's a problem, most of the time, it might have been that they underpaid or something like that, and you'd get the difference, you'd get more payment. There's a lot of leeway on that, but if it happened to be that they sent out a payment and they shouldn't have, then you could be in a situation that when you file your tax return in 2020, that they're going to say, hey, you don't qualify for the payment that was sent out, and then you might end up owing it back at that point in time. So just note that if it was something that was given and something strange, something unusual happened, like one of these circumstances, and you just know the IRS is incorrect in the payment, then you probably would be beneficial to give it back, because again, that thing could come into play, of course, when you file the taxes in 2020. You're going to file them in 2021 for 2020, which these early payments, they came out now, are basically going to be tied to. All right, back to the text. The IRS encourages people to share this information with family and friends. More information, economic impact payment frequently asked questions are here. There's a link to that here. There'll be a link to this in the description.